Welcome to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Coming up on today's show, we'll tell you how Republicans destroyed the city of Detroit and their plans to build a billionaire utopia on the ruins. And corporate America has taken over college campuses, and we'll discuss their plan to create a nation of corporate drone graduates. And a new study says that conservatives are actually happier than liberals, and we'll tell you why. Maybe Tea Party ignorance really is bliss. We have all that and more coming up, but right now, just remember, you've just stepped into the Ring of Fire.
You can't change Washington from the inside. You can only change it from the outside.
Grand jury secrecy rules.
For political gain.
The press can find out.
That has nothing to do with politics, but go ahead.
It wouldn't bother me.
Oops.
The city of Detroit's been driven into bankruptcy because of corrupt, anti-consumer, anti-worker Republican policies, and this wasn't an accident. It was part of the Republican plan to kill the Motor City. Joining me now to talk about that plan is investigative journalist Rick Outzen. Rick, Detroit is in ashes, and you get the impression that conservatives are jubilant about that. It's almost as if they would like to see that happen in other urban areas throughout the country. That's the only way that's what I read into this. What's your take?
Well, that's exactly how they're handling this. They're blaming, Democrats, liberal politicians, unions, pensions. It's a smorgasbord of everybody they want to go after. Unfortunately, or fortunately for us, none of that is true, and that's really what piqued my interest over the weekend in looking at this, Mike, because this isn't about it's somewhat about pensions, but it's not about unions and it's not about workers. It is an area that's a failure on the federal government's part and the state of Michigan's part as much as it is on the local government level.
Well, isn't one fundamental part, Rick, that we just keep dancing around the obvious, and that is when NAFTA and CAFTA and all the Bill Clinton idea for globalization started to happen, we knew, because we were being told even back then by people that were looking down the road, that what's going to happen is you're going to lose all of your manufacturing jobs in urban areas like Detroit. And when you lose those manufacturing jobs, of course, you lose your tax base. People are unemployed. They can't buy anything. And exactly what Bill Clinton was told back in the NAFTA days is occurring, and we have Detroit that's Exhibit A for that, don't we?
It really is. Detroit's an important city, Mike, because it is the manufacturing capital it was the fastest growing city in the United States coming out of World War II. It's where the African-American middle class got built in Detroit, Mike. That is where, when the workers from the South migrated, the African-Americans migrated from the South, they went to Detroit. This is where they became educated. This is where our leadership base came out of African-American community. And at one time, 1 out of 10 workers were working in manufacturing. 1 out of 10 residents of Detroit were in manufacturing. Now it's like 1 out of 50, and the population's decreasing. So NAFTA is a big role in this, Mike.
Yeah, so what's happened is that shift has finally occurred, the shift that they were warned about, the shift that they ignored because corporate America had such huge influence in this. But one thing, of course, that we love to see happen is, because it's so predictable, is that you have the right wing and you have corporate America jubilant about the idea that now you can take people's pension programs away from them. You can have workers that have invested their entire life working for a municipality, place like Detroit, and their pension is at risk because of Chapter 9. Well, the right wing is jubilant about that. That's exactly what they want to happen. But that is what's happening. Teachers, firefighters, policemen, virtually everybody who worked for that urban area, that person's at risk where it comes to the retirement and pension program.
Well, it is, and it is a big part of the $18 million that they're trying to deal with in bankruptcy, but the pensions aren't that out of line, Mike. That's what we found in our work. It's the average pension for a firefighter and policeman is $34,000, Mike. That's half of what it is in LA and New York. For the city employee, it's like 20,000. But the problem that they have, and it's because of this shrinking city and shrinking government, is they've got about 3,000 workers paying for pensions of paying into a plan that now is taking care of 9,600 retirees, which is way out of whack. Chicago's just the opposite, where they have more workers than they have retirees. Yes, the pension plan's a problem, but it's not what the right wing want us to believe it is.
Yeah, but nevertheless, what right now, I think where this story goes is it's typical, I think, in other urban areas. In this situation, you have the government Detroit and the municipality trying to push for a multi-million-dollar, $400 million hockey stadium while they're declaring bankruptcy. And we're seeing this, we saw it in Florida with Miami, right? I mean, you have them coming in, we want to build these billion-dollar stadiums, we want to use your tax base to do that. At the same time we're doing that, we want to give corporate America all types of subsidies. We want to give them the tax breaks, and all of a sudden there's simply not enough tax money to go around to take care of things like workers who are supposed to pick up the garbage. And in Detroit, that is where all of this ended. It's the extraction of money from the everyday worker, and then give that money to corporate America in one form or fashion, whether we're going to build a $400 million hockey stadium or whether they're going to give you a tax subsidies to come do business in our city. And that seems to be just, it's the game plan that we see in all these urban areas, that especially where you have Republican control.
Right. Well, and the other factor that you haven't brought up yet, but I think we need to talk about, is the pillage aspect of this. There's 78,000 abandoned structures in Detroit right now. But what are we hearing about? We're hearing about this plan called the Commonwealth of Belle Isle. A 100-acre island in Detroit that's city-owned. It's been a city park for over 100 years. And now there's a group wanting to come in, led by Rodney Lockwood Jr., who wants to buy it for $1 billion and created a gated community, an American version of Hong Kong.
Yeah, exactly. Probably more like Saipan, really, when you think about it.
Right.
But okay, so what you raise is privatization. That's what happens.
Right.
When you have all these voids take place, like when you don't have a fire department, you bring in a privatized fire department. Same way with police, same way with education, same way with trash pickup, whatever it is. You now have this element of privatization. In this
vultures, Mike, vultures. They're vultures, is what we have here. They're swooping in on the carcasses and trying to take advantage of cherry picking the things that they think are right, that will work for them on a profit side, and taking away the best assets from the citizens.
Well, but that's part of the methodology, isn't it? I mean, when we had Grover Norquist say that we wanted government so small that we could drown it in a bathtub, what he understood is once you do that, then you have the vultures, as you put it. You have the vultures come in and pick over the bones and take what they want to take. Belle Isle, as bizarre as the idea is, not to suggest it's ever going to succeed, but the very idea that Belle Isle is a suggestion, that you have corporate billionaires coming in saying, here's this great park right there in the middle of Detroit. We want to privatize it. We want to charge people $350,000 just to live here. We're going to have I think it went as far, Rick is saying, we want to have our own money. We want to have our own laws. We want to balkanize the United States. That's what this discussion is about. I mean, there's no other way to look at that other than to say that that's what they're saying. We want to balkanize these urban areas. And the very fact that that's discussions on the table should terrify all of us.
Well, Mike, it went further than that, because the state of Michigan, the governor, Rick Snyder, was about to sign a lease deal with the city of Detroit where they would take it over, make it a state park, make it an asset for the city, and keep it in the citizens' hands. As soon as this Commonwealth of Belle Isle idea started circulating, he pulled that off the table. So it has had an impact already. Whether it happens or not, the governor of Michigan believes it will.
Yeah, well, I mean, so what you have is something that seems to be forming up, an America that looks like a Mad Max movie.
Oh, yes.
To where you have these urban areas that have gone bankrupt, you have the billionaires coming in, picking over the bones, privatizing everything. raiding the pension programs, leaving people to, I suppose, to migrate to other parts of the country where they can get work, and then coming in and creating something that really looks like a Mad Max gated community where you have the have-nots on the outside and the billionaires on the inside. That is what the Belle Isle story looks like to me.
Right.
And it's not, you hear the discussion, well, it'll never happen. Well, not so fast, because the discussion is a serious discussion that they're having up in Detroit right now. And the very fact that they're having to even talk about this should cause concern for other major urban areas. Will the feds come in and give these, will they bail out Detroit the same way they bailed out the billionaire banker scammers up in Wall Street, do you think?
That, and that's a great point, Mike, and that's one I've also been thinking about a lot, is that, we said that Wall Street was too big to fail. And now, why aren't our cities treated the same way? Why aren't they given the same type of opportunities to deal with their pensions, to deal with their services? And we're not there's no discussion of that yet. And that's troubling to me, because it should be on the table here, because Detroit's not the only city, it's just the biggest city right now. And it needs to be, we need to have a program in place to work with this, just as we did with Wall Street, just as we did with the banks.
You have mayors all over the country right now, Rick, in major urban areas that are saying, well, let me get this right. You bailed out Wall Street, billions and billions of dollars, gave them money when we needed money. You ignored us. We had the same problems. It wasn't anything we created on our own, which they're always accused of. You're spending too much money, you're just not watching your purse. But really it comes down to the idea jobs have been shipped out of the major urban areas. So the mayors all over the country are saying to Washington, D.C., why won't you pay attention? Matter of fact, they said that to Bill Clinton, they said that to Obama, they said it to Bush, and there has been no attention paid to what's happening in these urban areas all over the country. And don't you think that this is just the beginning? I mean, when you understand what these mayors are saying in places like L.A. and New York and Miami and Birmingham, all over this country, mayors are concerned about this.
Well, I think it is the first step that we're starting to see. Detroit's the first one where it's there, but this, like we began in the very beginning of this segment, Mike, for the Republican wingnuts, these are the perfect targets. They can attack pensions, they can attack city workers, they can attack Democrats, they can attack African Americans, which is a part of this Detroit story, whether they want to totally come honest with that or not. And all those elements are out there, and if we don't deal with this, they're going to resurface over and over again.
Yeah, they're just they're great talking points. Greedy unions,
exactly.
Heavy taxation, too many regulations, teachers and firemen are paid too much money. We've been hearing it now for decades, and now Detroit becomes their talking point. Rick Outzen, thank you for joining me. I think we're just seeing the beginning of this story.
Thank you, Mike.
Rick Outzen is the publisher of the Independent Weekly. Coming up, we'll find out why corporate America is trying to take over higher education. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
Stand up, stand up.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. Corporate America has set their sights on America's higher education, and they're trying to use colleges as cheap sources of both labor and capital. They're also destroying the curriculum and critical thinking. I'm joined now by progressive radio host Richard Fowler to tell us why this is happening. Richard, it appears to me that corporate America has figured out that they don't really care if they have an educated workforce or not. I guess the other part of it is they don't care if they really have prosperous consumers either, because they realize that prosperous consumer can be obtained simply by lending money, and they make money, they make money lending money. So there's a lot of parts to what's happening with the college scene right now. The headline is, the college loans are going to increase, but there's so many parts to that story that we really have to be aware of. What's your take on what's really happening with this college loan story? It's a lot more involved than traditional or corporate media is talking about.
No, it's definitely more involved than corporate media is talking about, Pap. And I think to answer that question, you sort of have to look at what these banks are doing and why they're doing it. And very similar to the 2008 mortgage crisis, what banks are doing is they're packaging all the student loan debt and selling it off. So they see students as less of a investment and more of a commodity to make profit off of. And I think that it's really a conversation, it's a philosophical conversation about how we deal with our students and how we deal with America's future. And I think the banks, and sadly, I think those folks on the right of the political spectrum have made a decision that they see students as a way to gain profit and not as an investment in America's future.
Yeah, Richard Eskow, of course, is just a great thinker. Richard Eskow is regular on this program. He wrote a really great article on college students versus the corporate machine. And in there, he talked about the idea, and I know I've heard you talk about this as well, is you use the term the college student is now a commodity. And really, really the scary part about it is you have corporate America understanding they don't really need people with college educations anymore because they can outsource so much what they do. Eskow talks about this idea of what they call cloud intelligence. And cloud intelligence is you have people coming out of college and they're starting things like Fancy Hand or TaskRabbit, which are sites where very technical kind of information can be obtained by corporate America to those sites. In other words, they don't have to hire a college graduate because the college graduate, in order to stay alive, is having to fend for themselves the best way they can, much like they're having to do in India, where you maybe call, a law firm might go to India and say, do research for us. In the old days, the law firm would actually hire research lawyers to do that. And so the same thing's happening across the board in college. What's your take on it? Is Eskow, is he correct in his take about the attitude that corporate America has about the college student?
Yeah, I think he's completely right. I think what you fundamentally have is a race to the bottom when it comes to wages and the ideal of the American dream. We need to make the American dream as cheap as possible. We need to pay our workers as least as we can. And at the same time, you have a race to the top when it comes to college tuition, the amount of student loan debt that we have, and how we sell those commodities. So the banks are saying, what we need to do is find a way to make the most profit that we can. And in the meantime, corporations are saying we need to race to the bottom when it comes to wages, which are almost counterintuitive.
Well, I mean, what you end up with, according to Eskow and so many people that are looking at this, is you're looking at almost a workerless America, is the term that Eskow uses. I've heard other people use it, and that is where you don't really care much about the idea that a college graduate has a really all-encompassing degree. You don't care whether they really have studied humanities or the arts or anything that is well beyond their need to know. In other words, how do I do this particular narrow thing? So because of that, you have corporate America that are looking at college students really more as victims, where they come out of college, they don't really have work. You know, corporations aren't really hiring them the same way they used to because they can have this technical research done in places like India or now in the cloud right here in the United States. And so there's really no need for that well-equipped college graduate.
I think I see that. I think it's a little bit further is that beyond that, I think what we're seeing from work and from even like the jobs that they are creating in corporate America, they're very, very technical, specific jobs, so it doesn't require you to have critical thinking. You're just another widget in their big corporate system, and I think that's part of the problem. So what you do is you have a student who you continue to tell the same mantra of you go to school, you get good grades, you go to college, you become part of the middle class. And so that's the narrative that we say in America. But you attach a narrative to the fact that you go to school, you go to college, you get good grades, and then you come out, you're saddled with a mortgage, the amount of debt that you have. There are no job prospects, and all the job prospects that would sort of suit your degree or your diploma, you can't afford to take those jobs because they're not paying you enough. You can't afford to be a teacher because if you are a teacher, you can't afford your monthly student loan payment. So it's a situation where they sort of, it's really a kerfuffle of where politics has failed, where our elected officials and our country has failed the next generation.
I saw a quote, and I don't know if you saw. It was actually in one of Escow's articles. It was a PBS program, and a professor at New York University. He says, let me read it to you. He says, once somebody develops artificial intelligence programs, it doesn't just replace one worker, it replaces millions of workers. And so, and what's happening is the financial model for corporations right now is to say, look, we have all kinds of ways within what they call the talent cloud. You can get financial modelers, you can get translators, you can get business analysts, as Escow points out, simply in the cloud. You can subcontract in places like India or China. And U.S. is now fallen in line to where we are also part of that cloud, where a college graduate with a liberal arts kind of degree is far less important than somebody that can do a financial modeling.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, Pap. I think that's the problem that you're having. You're having this outsourcing, and the government is not doing anything to bring smarter jobs here. So fine, we're going to outsource jobs. We're going to have computerized cash registers. That's great. But now let's do what we can to retrain those workers, educate people to create those cash workers and create those cash registers and to create innovations for the future. And our government's not making those investments like we've seen them making in the past. So since we're not investing in the future, people are getting the same degrees and they have nothing to do when they graduate. And so you're in a situation where you have a huge youth unemployment problem, you have a huge student loan debt crisis problem, and this is sort of the perfect raw materials for another economic fire like we had in 2006 and 7. It's all sort of there. Everybody sees it happening. The bubble is coming towards us, and we're not doing anything about it. We're debating about whether we should keep Stafford rates low, which is just not good enough, right? I mean, and that's part of the problem. It's not good enough for just us to fix the federal loan system when we have a huge student loan debt crisis in this country that can take this country under if we let it.
Well, I mean, isn't part of the problem also, Richard, is that we don't really, in the United States, we used to want engineers coming out of college and they would go to work for an engineering firm. For technical people, we wanted graduating from college and coming to work, for corporate America. But we don't build anything anymore. I mean, it's not like we build bridges or roads or cars or like we used to. Now what we are, we're kind of in the financial commodity business, to where those manufacturing jobs, they're not quite as important anymore. The designers are not quite as important. And if they are, all we do is we globalize that too. We globalize the way we design a product, and we actually have them actually built out of this country. So it's not like we build anything, so the college graduate is even becoming less important in that regard. Maybe that is a reflection on why Congress has such disdain, the Republicans in particular have such disdain for college, for what's happening on our college campuses now, charging these kinds of ungodly amounts for a college loan.
Well, I think you're right, Pap, and I think we could fix that. I mean, a recent report came out from, I can't remember who exactly came from, but indicated that our infrastructure at best is a D, right? So it's on a great, and from an A to F scale, we're a D infrastructure wise. If we can invest in America's infrastructure, if we could create high-speed rail lines, if we could create the next-gen technology software so our planes could communicate better, if we could create new bridges, fix our roads, we would hire millions of people, millions of college graduates, millions of structural engineers, millions of secretaries.
But we're not doing that, are we, Richard?
We're not doing it because Congress has failed to act, and we've seen this Republican Party, all they want is, and I think John Boehner said it best a couple weeks ago, we want to be judged on how many bills we repeal instead of how many bills we pass. And so I think you have to look at this, you have to take it outside of the vacuum and look at the student loan debt crisis on a larger scale of the economics, of our nation and where we're going.
Richard, I'm already seeing the effect of it. I mean, we started asking serious questions at the high school level, in junior high school and elementary school, when it was need to know kind of an education. We started scratching our heads saying, well, isn't it important that we teach our children literature? Isn't it important that we teach them civics and history and philosophy and logic? Isn't that important? And so what's happened at that level has been that they pass standardized tests, need to know standardized tests. They're not critical thinkers. As a matter of fact, Texas actually put right into their discussion about their education system, we don't want to teach critical thinking. And so what ends up happening now, it's now made its next move to the university system. And now the university system is, we simply want to create a bunch of characters that we can move through quickly. 2 years probably of college is enough, because we don't have to teach humanities, we don't have to teach literature. It's all need to know education. By the way, while we're doing that, we're going to charge them ungodly amounts just to get that education. Do you see that happening, or are the people that are critics in saying that's happening, are they wrong?
It's definitely happening. I think the best way to put it is our schools have become, instead of a school building was made for students, and sadly our school buildings have become repositories for data. And that's happening all across the country, both in the K-12 education system as well as the college education system. How fast can you get them out? How quickly can you get them a job? How quickly can you move them through a system as a widget, instead of how do we develop the best people? How do we create the best critical thinking skills? How do we create the next Albert Einsteins and Mark Zuckerbergs and Bill Gateses of the world?
Who were critical thinkers.
Exactly, which is what we should be doing. Instead, we're creating widgets.
Yeah, it's getting to the point now, if you can imagine, I interview attorneys coming through looking for jobs, and I'll ask them, what's your favorite Steinbeck novel? And they haven't read Steinbeck, and they haven't read Hemingway or Joseph Conrad. They haven't read Kafka. They haven't read anybody that you say, okay, let me borrow from those experiences of those great authors and let me improve whatever it is I'm doing with that knowledge. Because they're not equipping college students with that kind of knowledge, because corporate America now has such a clear control over what's happening. In about 15 seconds, what's the quick answer here?
I don't know if there is a quick answer. I think one thing is Congress needs to get back to work, and I think us from the progressive side, we need to continue pushing on these issues and making these issues a broader, larger conversation. We need to engage communities, we need to engage families, we need to engage students and millennials about these issues and say, we have a fight on our hands, let's get to work.
Yeah, well, it is time to get to work, because right now, if you're a college student, you are upside down.
True.
Thanks for joining me, Richard. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Pat.
Richard Fowler is the host of The Richard Fowler Show. Coming up, we'll find out why the Republicans are trying to desperately destroy federal agencies that prevent the financial abuse of American citizens. I'm Mike Papantonio, and we'll be right back with more Ring of Fire.
You're watching Free Speech TV, a network powered by the people.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. American consumers no longer have the protection that kept them safe from dangerous products and financial fraud. The GOP killed those things with their push for deregulation. I have Kerry, Jardine, and Ann Murphy with me now to tell us what's happening. And the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has been under attack almost from the very first time we started hearing about it. The Republicans hate it. Because the Republicans really hate that kind of oversight. What have they done to interfere with the progression of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau?
Well, almost from the day that it started, the Republicans have flipped around and tried to defund the agency. Right now, it's funded as a portion of the Federal Reserve's budget, and that's been one line of attack to change the funding mechanism.
Well, one thing about the way that it's funded, to me, and I just want to know whether you've seen this in other agencies, is the thing that the Republicans hate about the CFPB is that they don't have control. They're not actually in control of how much money the agency gets, because the way that the law is written, they get, I think, 12% of a particular budget. And that 12% is their funding, and the Republicans have a hard time messing around with that. So the Republicans are complaining that there's no accountability. And what they really mean, there's no accountability to industry, because they can't fudge on the funding of that agency. Isn't that what you see here, Kerry?
It is, and Mike, the problem, what the Republicans have had to do is, because they don't control the funding. They did control the funding of the SEC when you had the 2008 meltdown, okay, and they loved that. But they don't control the funding now to the CFPB, and that just irritates them. And what they've done, as Ann mentioned, they basically are trying to figure out how to control that funding. They filibustered Cordray, who's the head of the CFPB. They filibustered his appointment.
Yeah.
All right. They now have a court case that is attacking his appointment that'll be heard this fall to try and decrease the power of the CFPB through that process. They have 2 or 3 other legislations that are in effect right now, Michael, to basically reduce the power of the CFPB. And then, as you know, and they're basically, you have a number of legislations in place that are trying to attack the power of many federal regulatory agencies across
SEC,
the board.
EPA, exactly. And why are they so terrified? Why are the Republicans so terrified by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? I mean, what is it that Bureau is supposed to do for Americans?
Well, they're terrified of the Bureau for the simple reason that it's one of the first agencies that's created specifically for consumers, to be working for consumers as opposed to Wall Street. On the other side of the aisle, we already have agencies like the OCC, which I want to point out, if you're talking about accountability, the accountability of the Bureau and the OCC has a lot of similar parallels, but I would suggest that the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency actually has less accountability than the Bureau that we're talking about today.
When the Republicans talk about accountability, though, Kerry, what they're talking about is they want a world where accountability means that industry gets to come in and pay that politician a bunch of money to go to the Hill and make threatening telephone calls to the agency. And the politician has the right to wind down investigations by the agency. The politician puts pressure on the agency to stop a particular use of a regulation that corporate America doesn't like. That's really what accountability means to Republicans. And so the Republicans are so upset that there's a few things that they can't tamper with where it comes to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And so they're getting all kinds of pressure from Wall Street and corporate America that is used to coming in and paying their way to get their way. Don't you kind of see it like that, Kerry?
Follow the money, Mike. Between 1999 and 2008, the financial industry paid $3.7 billion. Their lobby, $3.7 billion, primarily to the Republican Party. And the reason they do that is they want to control the upside of these investments. They want to be able to make the hundreds of millions of dollars on the upside of the investments, and then they basically want the American public to deal with the downside of the investment. When the investment runs out and it hits the beach, all right, and everything flies apart, they still have their money. It's the American public that is picking up the pieces. You have $20 trillion was the cost of the financial meltdown. 53 million people worldwide were put into poverty as a result of the 2008 meltdown. You had 200 to 400,000 babies that die every year since 2008 because of the loss of funding. Michael, it was a catastrophe. If the financial community, if the financial marketplace can't control the CFPB, and the CFPB puts into effect regulations that limit the type of speculative investments that were promoted by Wall Street, if they can't do that.
They weren't there to do that. And one thing we saw, Phil Gramm, who, by the way, interesting story about Phil Gramm. Phil Gramm came in, dismantled Glass-Steagall, attacked the SEC to the point to where he dried up their funding, made it virtually impossible for the SEC to have any kind of meaningful impact on Wall Street. As a matter of fact, helped pack the SEC with Wall Street scammers who are still there today. And Phil Gramm now, the end of the story, is working with UBS, getting paid millions and millions of dollars to go to work for the very people that he did all this bidding for. Now, do we ever turn things around from a consumer standpoint and without having the same kind of strength that Glass-Steagall gave us to protect consumers?
No, absolutely not. We are just taking baby steps in the right direction finally. We need these types of protections in place, and we absolutely need to have accountability that isn't tied to the large banks, that isn't being driven by the large banks. And again, that's what I and other consumers are hoping is happening with this Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I point out the Bureau has only been around for 2 years, but it's already returned $430 million to the pocketbooks of consumers.
Let's not forget that Wendy Graham received $1.85 million from Enron as she was appointed to the board of directors of Enron over an 8 or 9 year period of time.
That was Phil Graham's wife.
That was his wife.
So Phil Graham is out doing the bidding of the SEC. Actually, I mean, the bidding of Wall Street, trying to put up roadblocks to the SEC. While he's doing that, Wendy Graham, his wife, is working for Enron. It's very clear that Phil Graham personally got in the way of the SEC oversight of Enron. Anybody looking at the books, that when it was all over, all the dust cleared, you had statements that were strong as that anybody with a brain that had simply done a cursory look at how bad the books were for Enron could have told us what was getting ready to happen. But you had credit rating agencies involved, you had auditors involved, you had politicians involved, and that all became possible because Phil Graham, who now, again, is making millions of dollars working for the industry, Phil Graham got in the way of the regulatory process. Kerry, don't you see where this is all headed with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? Aren't they simply trying to say we can do the same thing to this bureau?
Exactly. That's their strategy. They've got a multi-pronged approach to trying to implement their strategy. The SEC was exactly where they wanted the SEC in 2008. It was underfunded. The funding was controlled by Congress. It didn't have the manpower to be able to implement the regulations that it had. It was weak. And as a result of that, that was exactly where the Republican Congress wanted the SEC. And then the amazing thing, Mike, is that then the Congress blames the SEC for the debacle in 2008 because it wasn't providing adequate oversight when it never had the funding in the first place to provide that type of oversight.
Right. And the way that this happens is you have a politician like Phil Graham that calls directly to the agency. And they threaten the agency. They say, how would you like your funding cut? How would you like us to engage in investigations where we bring you before Congress? How would you like us to put political pressure on you through your boss? Isn't that something that you've seen time and time again in the last couple of decades? And isn't that what the Republicans are worried about here, that they can't do that with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau if it's done right?
Absolutely. You're dead right on that. It's been going on like that for years and years, where a politician doesn't like what is being done by an agency, and they, like you said, they call up the agency and they threaten the funding. So that's the very heart of this issue here, is the Republicans don't feel that they have control over this particular agency. But that is important, and that's actually a good indicator that this agency is on the right track. When you see the Republicans scared that they don't have an agency in their back pocket, you know you're onto something good.
What are the most important things, Ann, that you hope this agency to accomplish if they are not roadblocked by Republicans?
Well, I hope it actually fulfills its mission, which is to help everyday consumers with both financial literacy, but also help them in day-to-day situations where they have a legitimate complaint against, for instance, a debt collector or a credit card company or a mortgage company. The agency is also set up specifically with the mandate to assist America's servicemen and women on financial topics, and also to help our nation's elderly population. Those are very important purposes, and I am hopeful that they will be accomplished.
Kerry, how will they interfere with it besides just picking up a telephone and threatening the hell out of the regulator? What else will they do? You mentioned a lawsuit. What is a lawsuit?
Well, they've got 2 lawsuits right now. The first lawsuit is on the appointment of Cordray. That'll be heard this fall. If they can go ahead, the Supreme Court, if the Supreme Court rules in their favor, there's debate as to what the overall effect will be, but any new regulations that were put in during Cordray's appointment could be attacked. That's one. The second lawsuit that they have is one of the problems that they had pre-2008 was that the SEC really didn't understand the financial products that were being put out by Wall Street. So what the CFPB has done is they've gone ahead and collected data from consumers to make sure that they understand what the products are out there and that they have a good understanding of what they are. The problem is that the that they're now facing the headwinds of Congress, which has filed, there's a Supreme Court suit that's been filed, which is attacking the data collection methods of the CFPB.
In other words, Kerry, what they do is they shut the door to meaningful information so to where the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau can actually make intelligent decisions by bringing a lawsuit saying you may not collect the data. I mean, that's really where this is headed.
You're exactly right.
If they can keep them blind, then everything's cool. Kerry, Ann, thank you for joining me. An important story. Again, it's It's simply not on the radar of corporate media, and we can understand why it isn't. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael.
When we come back, we'll take a look at why conservatives consistently rate themselves happier than liberals, if you can imagine. I'm Mike Papantonio, and you're watching Ring of Fire. We'll be right back.
Tune into Free Speech TV for Democracy Now!, a national, independent, award-winning news program bringing you people and perspectives rarely seen on corporate media.
Welcome back to Ring of Fire. I'm Mike Papantonio. A new study says that conservatives rate themselves as being happier than liberals. But there's a lot happening inside the brain of the Tea Partier. And joining me now to talk about that is Cliff Schecter, the best-selling author of The Real McCain. Cliff, we saw the Dunning-Kruger study, and liberals shook their head and said, you know, I knew that conservatives were a little off-center, but I didn't quite understand it until I saw the Dunning-Kruger study. We saw study after study where people are trying to understand what's the difference in the mind and the analytical process between a conservative and a progressive. This latest study that's come out is interesting in so many ways. This Canadian study from the university there, they come out and they say, look, conservatives are happier because they don't overanalyze the world. It's easier to tell a conservative what to do, and they fall into this authoritarian kind of mindset, and it tell them what to do and they're happy. What is your take on this study? It's confounding in so many ways.
Well, I think, let me put it this way. I agree overall. I mean, they always say ignorance is bliss. It's easy to look at the world as black and white because then it's not too complex. It's why you see a lot of conservatives engaging in conspiracy theories. There must be some great big force controlling things, because otherwise they'd have to analyze and sit around and think about what's going on truly out there. So I think that conservatives are racked with, in my opinion, and in other studies I've seen, with fear in a way that we're not. And the way that they make themselves happy and comfortable is through this sort of black and white. You know, George Bush said it perfectly. You're either with us or you're with the terrorists. And that's kind of the way they see everything. And if you push yourself into that corner, as they do, and you sort of let somebody be a daddy for you, an authoritarian, and tell you the way that things should be, then it's easier to be happy. So in that way, I can believe it.
Well, you know, go back, Cliff. As I looked at this study and followed this story, it made me think of Erich Fromm's Escape from Freedom. I mean, that's what he wrote about. He said, look, you have fascism rise up in countries because you have people who want that authority figure to tell them what to do. And and nothing is more true about the conservative than in America today. The second thing that we saw from Erich Fromm was he said, in order to make that happen, the people who are willing to be told what to do are willing to engage in what he called, he didn't call it social dominance, he had another way to describe it, but this study calls it social dominance orientation, and that is you have these folks that they're more than happy to be told what to do, and secondly, they're more than happy to trample on the rights and the lives of other people to keep order, the order that the authority tells them they must keep. What's your take on it?
Yeah, I think, look, that's exactly right. We saw this in many of the far-right movements of the 20th century, and frankly, this century, where people who you thought might be, you know, regular people, the guy next door, suddenly they turn into these people marching in lockstep. And they do that because it's easier. It's because that's what brings, you know, if you don't question, you know, what people are telling you, then the world sort of takes, you know, it means something to you. It's organized in a way that it's chaotic if you don't do that. I think that's exactly right. I'd throw in also, if you ever read the great work by Richard Hofstadter, The Paranoid Style of American Politics,
Of course.
I find that's very much the same thing. It's, people filled with breathless conspiracy who go to one extreme because it's easier to be on that extreme. It's easier to accept things then, and then you don't have to do too much thinking, quite frankly.
Well, I mean, the end of this study though tells us that because you have the conservative that's willing and actually wants to be told what to do, doesn't really want to think for themselves, and because they are so ready to trample on the rights to follow the orders of that authority, that for some reason it gives them comfort. It gives them a sense that they can overcome the fear that we've seen in other studies that conservatives are extremely fearful of the world, but it gives them a comfort that makes them at peace in some ways. Again, we begin this discussion by the study coming out and saying that conservatives, a Tea Party, old grump white guy, is happier than a progressive. And we see these Tea Partiers with the most hateful ways about them out in protest, and we say this male, pale, stale old grump can't be all that happy. And this study comes along and says, no, they're pretty happy.
Well, yeah, and that's the tough part of it to accept, because look, we see Louis Gohmert, Michelle Bachmann, and it's kind of hard to think that they're happy people, isn't it? I think when they confront us, they see it such as a clash of civilizations, and the world will come to an end. Again, this breathless sort of conspiracy, that then they're very unhappy. But most of the time, especially if they're among their own, if they can convince themselves that they're in the right, God ordained this, or some authoritarian figure ordained this is the way it's supposed to be, they're happier people. And look, you know this, Pat, because people like you and I, we worry about climate change, right? We worry when we see a case like the Trayvon Martin case about racism that still is here in America.
It makes us uneasy, doesn't it? Yeah. Well, drill down in it, and it's what you said in your best New York Times bestseller, the McCain book. It was just great work. And that's kind of what you analyzed, is the people who were attracted to McCain were people who really didn't have to think. They didn't have to analyze and overanalyze all of the barnacles that not only McCain had on him, but the Republicans had on him, because they could accept what they were told. And part of this Canadian study comes up, and raises the question. I mean, do these people who, they get married, they have this religious center, and they're easily told what to do? Maybe there is some benefit in life's happiness in doing those things and not really thinking about the tough questions that, unfortunately, you and I have to think about a lot.
I'd rather be unhappy than, Pat. I've had neighbors like this. Maybe you have too. They seem like the nicest people in the world, and they start coming out with these crazy right-wing, theories about, and they do seem happy. They've got their marriage and their family and go to church every Sunday. But again, I guess that can keep you happy. It also keeps most of the world subjugated, is frankly what it does. So for people like you and me, I suppose if we have to be a little bit less happy, if that's what it comes down to fight for equality for all, then I guess that's where we are.
Yeah, because the second prong of what Canada says is one of the reasons that they're happy is that they're so willing to keep everybody else down. They're so willing to trample on the rights of others if that authoritarian figure tells them that's what they must do to keep order. Cliff Schecter, thank you for joining me. Let's be happy today.
I'm going to do my best. I'm going to smile through the day, Pat.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ben.
One of the most popular cholesterol drugs on the market was recently found to have severe negative side effects for female patients. I'm joined now by consumer attorney Daniel Nigh to give us the latest news about Big Pharma's deadly quest for profits. Daniel, another drug in the news. It's a weekly story. Lipitor, tell us what's happening.
Sure. There's a new study that's come out that points a link between women taking Lipitor and showing that they have an increased risk of contracting type 2 diabetes as a result of that.
Well, I mean, the problem is Lipitor is so widely used. It's one of those drugs that you see constantly advertised, and I haven't seen any discussion in corporate media about this type 2 diabetes problem in women taking Lipitor. Are these new studies that are coming out, or where's this information coming from?
No, they're not new studies, and I think what happens here is what we see time and time again. When negative information comes out, these corporations do as much as they can to bury that negative information. In fact, in 2012, the FDA approved a warning label change to show the risk of increased risk of type 2 diabetes as a result of taking Lipitor. But again, as a result of the way in which things happen, sales reps time and time again will diffuse that risk and continue to outweigh the benefits.
So the risk-benefit analysis of the studies, what are the studies saying? I know there's one study that was actually paid for by Pfizer. I mean, they actually the people who performed the study had direct financial ties to Lipitor and Pfizer. And even that study was a mixed bag. I mean, they said, yes, there is an increased risk of diabetes, but maybe the risk-benefit analysis still tells you you should take Lipitor. I'm not really sure about that one. What's your take on it?
Well, that's a good question, Pat. That study there alone showed a 37% increase of contracting type 2 diabetes as a result of taking Lipitor versus a placebo. And I think what we see for the rest of the study is just the paid author by Pfizer, trying to downplay those results.
Yeah, I mean,
but it's clear.
The first thing you look at with any story like this is who's paying for the study, and here you've got Pfizer actually paying direct financial ties to the people doing this. 3 co-researchers are Pfizer employees, and they're still saying, you know what, we're seeing an increase, especially with women. And what is the distinction between women taking Lipitor and men taking Lipitor? This stuff's been sold like candy, for God's sakes.
Right. The thing is that for women, what we're seeing in many of these studies, study after study after study, is showing that for women, they're at a higher risk than men, much higher risk than men, of contracting type 2 diabetes as a result of taking Lipitor. And on the flip side, it's much less effective for women than men to take Lipitor and treat, whether it be heart disease or many of these women who are just taking it because of bad cholesterol, probably should be reevaluating that decision based on some of these studies.
Well, okay, here's the point. In the study itself, it says, look, if somebody has elevated triglycerides, then they have to be extra careful of developing type 2 diabetes if they're taking Lipitor. Isn't that one of the reasons people take Lipitor? I mean, I'm not seeing what the distinction is here. How Pfizer stands behind this as being a drug where the risk-benefit ratio is so great when we start seeing the results that we're seeing here right now.
That's right. I mean, obviously, the triglycerides is one of the risk of contracting type 2 diabetes, and it's also one of the same reasons as why you would be taking Lipitor. I think it comes down to, the whole point of this whole thing is, Lipitor has an increased risk of contracting type 2 diabetes, even compared to all the other statins out there on the market. And all those other statins, they're taking those statins because they have the high triglycerides or the other risk factors of what may cause type 2 diabetes. But Lipitor has the increased risk of getting type 2 diabetes versus all those other statins.
And are the warnings there adequate?
Well, as we see again, time and time again, there's a warning change that comes out February of 2012. What we see oftentimes is it's one warning in a list of 30 different warnings. It doesn't explain just how bad it is for women. It doesn't explain how ineffective the treatment is for many women. And it doesn't adequately explain to a doctor who's trying to decide whether or not a woman patient comes in, whether or not he should be prescribing this drug to women, where the only risk factor they have is some type of determination that they have bad cholesterol.
Daniel Nigh, another one of those troubling pharmaceutical stories that seem to be popping up every week. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Pat.
That's it for this week's Ring of Fire, but you can keep up with us throughout the week online at ringoffireradio.com or on Twitter at Ring of Fire Radio and on Facebook. I'm Mike Papantonio. We'll see you next week right here on Ring of Fire.